Hey gamers, Maniac here with Mind of Maniac. Just coming at you. For those of you guys who don't know what Mind of Maniac is, it's a bit of an unscripted series where I talk about various gaming topics. Some of them are by request, and if you have a request for a future Mind of Maniac, just post a comment below and tell me what you have in mind, what you'd like me to talk about. Or they're just from the top of my head. And recently, I've been kicking this topic around for the past few days, and I wanted to talk about it with you guys. And that is game saves and the history of game saving, specifically with console games. When you're dealing with, or when you bought or purchased a game, you would literally have to buy it on some type of read-only memory for a console at least. The game cartridges that came for the original Nintendo, for example, was basically just read-only memory. You'd have to finish the game in one sitting if you were able to finish it at all. Sometimes that's not convenient. Sometimes people just don't have the time to play through a game like Super Mario Brothers all in one sitting. There were workarounds that Nintendo tried to do in the interim of that sort of thing. Like they implemented a password system, they implemented warp zones so you could bypass unneeded areas and things like that, areas that you didn't want to have to play through. But for the most part, there were secrets that were worked into the game. So if you didn't know either what the secret was as to the warp or something like that, or if you forgot your password, or if you didn't have, or you lost your copy of Nintendo Power or your other hint book or something like that, or you misplaced where you wrote down your game password was, you'd be out of luck. You'd have to replay the game all over again, which was not really an elegant solution. For the PC, it wasn't really that much of a problem. Games shipped in floppy disks way back in the day, and those had a bit of read-write memory to them. You could read and write to floppy disks, so you could put save games directly on your floppy disk if you didn't have internal memory on your computer. So it worked out pretty well. There was later a problem when games were starting to ship on read-only memory like CD-ROMs and DVD-ROMs, but I'll get to that later. But for game consoles finally decided, okay, we're going to need something else, and Nintendo started shipping games that needed it with a type of extra RAM plus battery backup. I think one of the first games that did this in the United States was Legend of Zelda, which was a very long game that required a kind of save state. The problem was, I don't think technology was ready for that sort of thing. The best they could do was offer a read-only memory with this. There was no way to have a read-only memory that would save its status as if it ever, if it didn't have any power to it. Basically, that kind of technology didn't exist yet. You could have either read-only memory, or you could have random access memory that could store data on a type of flash. But as soon as it lost power, the data would automatically be lost. And that's how random access memory still works to this day on computers. The second you turn your computer off, all the RAM that's in, all the data that's in the RAM is just gone. It's gone completely, which is what you want. You would store data somewhere other than the RAM, basically. So it wasn't that elegant a solution because they were dependent upon the battery. And batteries don't last forever. Batteries can explode, batteries can die, there's a lot of problems with batteries. And if your battery died for whatever reason, you'd lose your saves, and you wouldn't be able to make new ones. On top of that, if you wanted to fix it so your games could be saved, well, you couldn't save anything that was lost. You'd be able to make new memories, new saves, and that sort of thing. The problem was that you'd have to take apart your game pack, you'd have to figure out how the battery backup was kept in there. A lot of times they were glued or soldered into place. Very difficult to remove unless you were like a hardcore do-it-yourselfer. That sort of, and then get a compatible battery that fit perfectly and either solder it back in place or, something. Basically, it was basically not an elegant solution. There were other consoles that later on that decided to use flash memory when they needed to, but they at least made it a bit easier to store flash memory. Like I remember, I think the Saturn had flash memory. that was stored on the console itself. But I think they made it easy to actually, if the battery ever died, to replace the battery. You'd still lose your data though. Later on, the PC started having this problem because the PC started shipping on CD-ROMs, which offered a lot of storage but no writable access memory. So by that point, however, most computers had hard drives with them. So you basically just put the saves on the hard drive and read the game from the disk, and then in fact it got to a point where it was just easier to just install an entire game from the disk to the hard drive and the saves with it. So by that point, hard drives weren't much, pretty much took care of the computer, the computer user. But there was eventually the game consoles wanted to actually make use of the CD-ROM technology. And it offered its own problem in the fact of you didn't have memory. You didn't have a way to store memory on a CD-ROM. You either have to have some kind of solution on a console itself, some storage on a console itself, or something else had to be done. And I think that Sony was the company that really did it for me. I think Sony was the company that ushered in a whole new wave of that answer. And that is with the Sony memory card. Anybody remember these? These things were fantastic. I love these things. This is a Sony memory card that was used for a Sony PlayStation, or if you would want to call it a PlayStation 1 basically. This particular model was the stock Sony model. I believe this was the only model that Sony ever produced for the PlayStation. It stored about 15 blocks of storage with it. But the good part about it was that once this memory was on here, this memory was in here. This memory wasn't going anywhere. Maybe that was the problem with it. They couldn't create something bigger with larger capacity that would not break compatibility or hold the storage forever, that sort of thing. This, as far as I'm concerned, ushered in a whole new age of gameplay. Because, let's say, for example, I'm playing Metal Gear Solid on my PlayStation 1. Or PlayStation, whatever you want to call it, PSX, whatever. I store my save games on my PlayStation. I want to play the game on my friend's system. Because I'm going over to my friend's house to play Metal Gear Solid. He's already got a copy of the game. He's already got a PlayStation. No big deal, right? All I had to do was bring this with me to my friend's house. All my saves could be loaded and my friend could see where my progress was, how much further along I was, what I had unlocked, that sort of thing. And I could just take it with me. There was no need for any type of encryption. There was no need of any type of login information or anything like that. As long as you had the unit with you, the saves were good. Third parties tried to copy this. There were a lot of, or quote-unquote, improve on this. There were a lot of third-party memory cards that I saw released for the PlayStation. None of them worked. There were a few reasons why none of them worked. While they did offer, or claim to offer, more storage capacity than this, like I said, this only had about 15 blocks of memory, that under normal circumstances would consider, well, that would hold 15 saves. But there were some games that required maybe 2 blocks for one save, and sometimes they'd have to have some kind of settings save or something like that as well. So not everything could be stored in not everything could be considered 15 blocks, 15 saves. There was some, like I said, there were some games that took up more memory than that. The problem was that was it. But so you'd have to buy a bunch of these. There were only 2 memory card reader slots, and not every single game could read off the second one. So you could buy 2 memory cards and use them actively on certain games that supported it, but for the most part, you basically have to buy a bunch of these and have different saves stored on them and things like that. In my case, I only picked up 1 because that only turned out to be all I ever needed. But I'm sure for some people, they probably have a few of those lying around. The great thing about those was that a Sony memory card never gave me any problems at all. Whereas I was hearing some serious nightmare stories, even back when the PlayStation 1 was the definitive console, meaning that there was no PlayStation 2, there was no, this was the console everybody was playing, actively. I noticed that I had friends, heck, I once had a teacher tell me that they were playing a really long game, and halfway through it, like, I don't know, 30 hours in or something like that, their memory card erased themselves. Like, erased itself, just randomly. It just randomly just blanked out. They lost everything. The game crashed, and they lost all of their game progress and everything else. How sad. You know, how sad that about that. That's just horrible. And they weren't alone. I heard a lot of, I remember hearing troubleshooting on PlayStation, you know, the early PlayStation, you know, website and things like that, where they used to do webcasts and stuff like that, where they do troubleshooting occasionally and show new games. I remember actually that they would show games like they would actually, people were troubleshooting for this kind of stuff. They'd say, "Oh, I'm having a problem with my memory card. I can't save, or I can't load saves from my memory card," and they basically say, "It sounds like you're using a third-party memory card or a third-party controller," because we've never ever had any problem saving, loading, or losing saves on a memory card that was made by Sony. And just to postscript that story, because I really wanted to tell this story, just to postscript that, I sold my PlayStation 1 probably around the same time that the PlayStation 2 came out, because I was planning on upgrading. It took me a couple of years to afford an upgrade, but I eventually did get one. When I sold my old PlayStation 1 to a friend, my stipulation was, you can have the controller, you can have the cables. I had a few different video cables. I said you can have them all. You can have the console itself, you can have all the controllers, but there are two things that you cannot have as part of the price. One is you can't have the memory card, you got to have one of your own or buy one off the shelf. And two is you can't have the games. Like, I'm holding on to my games and I'm holding on to my memory card in case I ever decide to upgrade. But I was fine with that. He got a pretty good, I gave him a pretty good deal on that PlayStation. I think I sold it to him for like $60 or something like that. It's just a unit and cables. So my friend was happy because he had a working PlayStation 1. I was happy because I still saved my games. 5 years later, I get a PlayStation 2. I buy a PS2 Slim for myself because I wanted to play Metal Gear 3 on it. And I decided, well, let's see if my original PlayStation 1 games actually still work on this thing. And yes, what do you call it? A PS2 is backwards compatible, so it was able to run the games. I was just curious if my memory card, which had been collecting dust on a shelf for 5 years, still worked. In fact, it was this memory card. The data was still in there. I still had my original Metal Gear saves. I still had all my original Siphon Filter saves. I was so stoked. When the PS2 launched, they offered the same solution. That was just to show how ahead of the curve this was. It stayed with them for one whole generation. When the PS2 came out, it had its own particular memory card. There were a few things that they did to break compatibility with the PlayStation 1, so you couldn't use these on PlayStation 1 and they wouldn't work on PlayStation 1 games. But the PS2 memory card reader actually could read PS1 cards if you were loading or running a PS1 game on it. So these would work perfectly for your saves for PlayStation 2 games, and these would work perfectly on PlayStation 2 as long as you're using a PS1 game. Problem was that the data couldn't be transferred between one or another, and although it could be copied to an identical memory card type. But the other problem was that this was the only storage that they offered, 8 megabytes for this one. There were other third-party memory cards that offered more, but none were made by Sony. I think Sony released some clear models, like they could get a double pack with like a translucent blue and a translucent red. You might even still be able to find new copies of those still in the package. But for the most part, this was what was offered. This is what I picked up for like $20 or something like that. Totally worth it. You couldn't save PS2 games without it. So these were ubiquitous. Same basic principle. You'd be able to load this on another person's system and they'd be able to work. However, Microsoft had their own ideas for what they were going to offer. They actually shipped, when they shipped the... let me finish. Let me tell one other thing. Nintendo actually thought this was so interesting when they finally shipped the GameCube with their own read-only memory DVD, because they couldn't use, it just wasn't cost-effective to use flash memory anymore, or read-only memory for game cards and stuff like that. They kind of copied Sony's design by shipping with a smaller DVD, which was read-only memory, but they had their own memory card for the GameCube. I believe the original model that they had. But the thing is that Nintendo did was, the original model memory card that they had, I think was only about 50 blocks of memory or something like that. But not too long after that, they actually released a 250 block model, which they figured would be enough model memory for everybody. And, well, to be perfectly honest, it was up until Resident Evil 4 came out. Resident Evil 4 slaves took up a lot of blocks of memory on a GameCube. So they later on released, like, I think it was like a 1024 slot memory card as well. So Nintendo actually released a very similar, but they at least were releasing larger models. The problem I think with the 1024s were that I think really old GameCube games weren't compatible with it or that sort of thing, or only could use so much memory in the blocks, that sort of thing. But for the most part, I think most people, I don't think anybody had any problems with a 250 block model. I know I don't think I did. With any of the games that I had. So that was the memory problem. That was like basically it for the GameCube memory, at least. In fact, actually, the Wii actually included with it not just GameCube controller supports when it launched, but also GameCube memory card slots as well. So it could fully do backwards compatibility, like the PS2 did with the PS1. In the case of Xbox, they decided to go a different route. They shipped with a hard drive. They did offer a memory unit for it, but I never bought one. There was no reason to. It had a lot of problems with it. In particular, with the memory units, there were 3 particular problems I can think of with it. One was that it wasn't big enough to fit most DLC. So you wouldn't be able to transfer, and if you didn't have if a friend didn't have Xbox Live access, you wouldn't be able to bring the DLC over to, or patches over to their system. Two was a lot of game saves were too big to fit onto a memory card. So you'd have to save the game to your hard drive. You'd have to save your game file to the hard drive, and you'd never be able to take it anywhere or take it off of the Xbox. It would be on there forever because it was too big to fit onto a memory card. The other problem was that sometimes game developers decided to copy protect the Xbox One save. So in theory, they would be able to transfer, but they wouldn't be allowed to because they'd be copy protected or something for some odd reason. So the memory units were pretty much only useful for one thing. They could store an Xbox Live profile, which is no point anymore because Xbox Live has been shut down for the original Xbox. Even if you have an Xbox Live profile that's valid on the Xbox 360, the Xbox One support has been completely discontinued. I'm sorry, the original Xbox support for Xbox Live has been completely discontinued. So that's a bit of an issue. But I don't know, I really prefer these days. I miss these days where I could, just bring this over. In fact, actually, when the PlayStation 3 shipped, it had full backwards compatibility, but it didn't come with any memory card slots. But they did offer this. It was about 15 bucks. It was a memory card adapter. And what it would do was, if you take a PS1 or PS2 memory card, and using the USB cable that came with your controller, you could copy or transfer saves. You couldn't access saves directly, meaning that you couldn't load a save directly from a memory card if it was connected to the PS1. You'd have to create virtual ones. But you could create as many virtual memory cards on a PS3 that you had enough space for. It would set aside memory, that sort of thing. And you could copy and transfer your saves over from the memory card to another. That was a great decision. That was fantastic. That worked perfectly for me. So that was the way I liked it. That was great. That was a great way to work. I was appreciative that they did that. That way I didn't lose any of my memory, my save games when I was loading games on the PS3. And I still use that PS3 to play PS2 and PS1 games. My data is not lost. It's great. But moving on, past the Xbox, it seemed to be that the memory unit was dying by that point. I think that it had one last hurrah, and when there was a transitional period between the Xbox generation, original Xbox, PS2, GameCube, and the Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii generation in the form of the handheld portables. Nintendo with the DS and Sony with the PlayStation Portable. Their decision was to at least for Nintendo's decision, to just kind of like what they have with the original game carts and things like that, to have save games on the DS game, have a little bit of memory, write memory on the game carts itself. I have no idea if those carts actually came with a battery backup or something like that. I think they might have, but don't totally quote me on that. My research I've done has been inconclusive. Some research has said it did come with a battery backup for some of those original games, and some have said nothing. So I don't know. The PS Portable, on the other hand, had a read-only type of game memory, the UMD slot. You couldn't save to that sort of thing. So what they did instead was they had included a memory stick slot, which were used for cameras. And Sony was doing a lot with these back in the day. So what you would do was you'd keep keep a memory stick in your PSP's memory stick slot, and store all your save games to that memory stick. This pretty much took over for the portables. And the cool thing was that you could take them out, you could load games on them, you could load DLC on them, you could upgrade them, you could have some saves on one memory stick and some games on one memory stick and other games on another one, that sort of thing. It worked really well. It later got a bit tougher when they started offering game downloads and things like that through PlayStation Network. You had to do authorizations and things like that for the PlayStation Portable. But as long as the PlayStation Portable was authorized, you could hot swap memory sticks and things like that with little regard. So this kind of became that. In fact, actually, the PlayStation 3 actually came with memory stick slots as well as other slots for other memory cards and things like that if you're using camera. So you could, copy data and that sort of thing. Xbox, on the other hand, when the 360 came out, decided to do something different, and so did Nintendo. Nintendo decided to ship with internal flash memory. I think it was about 512 of internal flash memory. It was enough for saves and maybe a few downloadable games that were small, but it wasn't a lot. The Wii also came with a memory card. I believe it was an SD card slot by standard. Most of the time, I think when it shipped, it only came with for picture viewing and things like that. So you could view pictures that you had taken on your Nintendo Wii. But later on, they did a firmware update where they expanded so that you could store a backup of game installations. When they had a lot of WiiWare games and things like that, it took up a lot of space. You could store your games onto an SD card or copy your saves temporarily. I don't think you could load saves from it, but you could copy saves and that sort of thing. That wasn't at launch though. That came with a firmware update on the Wii. But for the most part, for most players, Wii basically just used its own internal memory. If you wanted to play the particular games that were on your Wii, you'd have to bring your Wii over to a friend's house. That was basically how it worked. For the Xbox 360, they went a completely different route. For the Xbox 360, they actually ship with external hard drives. I know them selling them external hard drives. They're kind of internal hard drives, but they're replaceable. They're very easily replaceable, and because of that, I'm kind of considering them by that definition to be external drives, even though they do slide in and slide out of the system themselves. Because they can be removed so easily, I'm considering them external. That worked much better. They did have their own proprietary memory units, but they were nothing in storage capacity in comparison to what a hard drive could do, even a shipped hard drive could do. The Xbox 360, when it launched, had no internal memory of its own, requiring you to either purchase a hard drive with it or a memory unit with it in order to store it. The problem was that the memory units only had, at launch, I think about 15 megabytes of storage capacity, and a hard drive only had about 12 gigabytes of storage capacity. It was not a lot of memory. I must have upgraded my hard drive at least 3 times, and I never bothered with a memory unit. It had less of Microsoft kind of worked around this whole memory unit limitation by basically just putting in restrictions to developers. One, they couldn't rely on a hard drive. One, you had a limit as to how big downloadable games could be. I think their limit was 50 megabytes at the time. 2, you could store Xbox Live profiles and that sort of thing on it. It was small enough. So it worked. You couldn't have large size patches. I think that maybe 2 to 4 megabytes was the absolute maximum size you could have for a patch. Everything else had to be DLC. That sort of thing. So it worked for a while, but they couldn't stifle innovation for long. Games had to become bigger. The games had to start relying on a hard drive, and the memory units were just too small and too expensive to be useful, especially given the fact of these bad boys, USB memory sticks. I don't even know what you would want to call them. These bad boys are pretty much everywhere nowadays. They've been taking over for the past 10 years, easy. They're faster than floppy drives. They're read and write capable, so you don't have to worry about burning memory to them like you had to with a CD-ROM. They are pretty much universally compatible with anything that has a USB port in a modern operating system. You could load whatever data you wanted on it, documents, emails, pictures, that sort of thing, easily without the need of an extra drive. Like, you don't need a floppy drive, you don't need a CD drive on your computer in order to read data off of this thing or write data to it to get data off the drive. And that's basically it. This was great. Then they became, because there was a lot of manufacturers that were using these things expanded in memory quite quickly, and they also expanded in space, it lowered in price quite quickly. So very, very, very soon, these things became quite ubiquitous. And people wanted developers to start dealing with these kind of things as opposed to proprietary memory, like the Xbox 360 memory unit. In response to this, not too long ago, maybe a couple of years ago, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, Xbox updated their firmware to support these. I think it was around the time that the model Slim had come out. The cool thing about these was that they actually could have a larger storage capacity. Microsoft limited storage capacity on these things between 1 and 16 gigs. You had to have at least a 1 gig memory USB stick up to a maximum of a 16 gig memory stick in order to store data to it. But you could store data, you could store saves, DLC, that sort of thing to these things, as long as it was formatted. However, the PlayStation 3 was already compatible with these things at launch. They had USB memory slot, they had USB slots in the front, and they could copy and read and write memory and that sort of thing. So that was what was so great about it, is like these worked really well. These have pretty much replaced this. I gotta say, maybe I'm a bit nostalgic, maybe I'm a bit nostalgic for the old days. I kind of missed the days where in fact, I remember G4 a long time ago actually had a guy, it was back when G4 was good, when it launched, they had all kinds of bumpers and stuff like that for their network, and one was a guy dying in a hospital bed of serious injuries, and he's telling his friend who's by his side, "Take my memory card. With it, you can beat level 4. Avoid the avoid the dragon. You're the last hope you're the last hope." Those were good times, and I miss those times. That having been said, like I said, now that these have been outmoded, we could be dealing with these from now on. They're universal. They work on computers. They work on consoles. This, they fit in your pocket. There you have it. So I've talked about the past and present of memory for the Mind of Maniac, but I think I want to talk a little bit about the future, and that's what I want to save for a part 2. So stay tuned to this space, guys. This is Mind of Maniac. I'll see you next time. Over and out. Take care.